Alright, so let's start with our first inferential statistical test, which is independent samples t-test. And we conduct the independent samples t-test when we're comparing two groups, right? And those two groups are going to come from a nominal or an ordinal independent variable, where we're using those groups as categories. And we're trying to see if these two groups differ on two means, right? Each of these groups has their own mean. So that means we're going to have either an ordinal variable that we can calculate means for, or an interval or ratio variable. And that variable is going to be our dependent variable. So we want to see, is there a difference between our two groups on our two means? So for example, is there a difference between men and women on the number of zombies each of those groups encounter on average? So steps 1 and steps 2. So what is step 1? Stating the null hypothesis. And what do we always assume in the null hypothesis? We assume that there are no differences. So we're simply going to state for our template there is no difference between group 1 and group 2 on whatever our dependent variable is. So in this case, if you wanted to look at the differences between men and women on the number of zombies they encounter, it's simply there is no difference between males and females on the number of zombies encountered. And we can then go ahead and do our equation. Step 2 is what? Stating the alternative hypothesis. And so when we state the alternative hypothesis, what are we positing? That there is a difference. So it's simply there is a difference between whatever our two groups are on our dependent variable. And so there is a difference between males and females on the number of zombies that they encounter. So now we completed steps 1 and steps 2 of our 5-step process. So step 3 is actually obtaining and calculating our test statistic. So in this case, we're not going to hand calculate it. We're going to save that for next week. This week, we're just going to learn how do we get our test statistic through SPSS. So let's go ahead and go to SPSS to go ahead and run our independent samples t-test analysis. So here's our data set. It doesn't matter if you're in variable view or in data view. So we're going to go to Analyze. Since we want to compare the differences between two means, we go to Compare Means, and we're going to conduct an independent samples t-test. So we're going to select independent samples t-test. And now we see this window pop up. We can make it a little bit bigger if we want to, just so we can see our variables. And you can also right-click to toggle between the variable name and the actual variable label itself. So we want to know whether or not there's a difference between men and women on the number of zombies they encounter. So our test variable is going to be our dependent variable, which in this case is what variable? Number of zombies you encountered. So we can see how many zombies have you encountered. So we're going to select on that. And then we use this arrow to move it over under our test variable, which is our dependent variable. So that means grouping variable is which variable? Our independent variable, right? And this is one that has the groups, hence grouping variable. And so what's the variable that we're looking at as our independent variable? Gender. So we highlight gender, and then we use this arrow to move it into our grouping variable. Now we see we have 2 question marks. Well, this 2 question marks is saying, well, what are the groups that we are going to use that we're trying to see if there's a difference between? So that's what we have, so now click on Define Groups. So we click on Define Groups, and then you have to specify here, what are the 2 groups that we're going to compare? We know that we're using males and females, but we can't type in here males and females. If I try to type males and females, notice what happens. It makes a little noise. So that means it wants the code, it wants the number. So do you remember what we coded males and females as? Well, if you're not sure, we can also look here in gender and we can see 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1. So we can say 0 is our males and 1 is our females. We need to define what our groups are. Once you've done that, click on Continue. And now we see those question marks are gone, and now we have a 0 and a 1, and then we've defined our independent variable. We click on Options, take a look. Confidence interval percentage, 95%. Remember what we learned about confidence intervals last week? Well, by default, we can see that 95% is the confidence interval, which means that 5% is how much we're giving ourselves our error, which means that is our significance level, 0.05. So now that we've seen that, we've identified our dependent variable, defined our independent variable, we can go ahead and click on OK. And we get a new window that has our output. So we have two tables. We see our t-test analysis, and then we have our first table, which is group statistics, and then we have our second table, independent samples test. So let's take a look at our first table, group statistics. We see it has gender, which is our independent variable, and we see the two groups that our gender has, males and females. And all this data here is related to our dependent variable, which is how many zombies have you encountered. So we see we have 10 males and 10 females. We see we have an average of 8.1 zombies encountered for males and 4 zombies on average that females encountered. We see the standard deviation and we see the standard error of the mean. So this is giving us all of our descriptive statistics for our variables. Now if we take a look at our second table, I'm going to go ahead and close this so we can get this all on one screen. So now we see our second table. And really this is what we're going to allow us to go ahead and complete step 3, which is calculating or obtaining our test statistic. So do you remember what our independent samples test statistic is? Well, it's our t-test. And we see here is our t, 3.567, 3.567. So we've found out that this is our t-test, our test statistic, 3.567. The next step is then to make a decision. Step 4. So this is where we have to look at sig. Do you remember sig? So sig is our p-value. So sig, in this case, we have two different sigs. We have a sig here and we have a sig here. Well, as we'll learn in more detail next week, the reason that we have two t-tests is we have two different rows. And these two different rows have different sets of statistics because one of these rows assumes equal variances and the other row does not assume equal variances. And we decide whether or not we assume equal variances or not based upon this first p-value. This p-value is the test for equality of variances. This is Levene's test. And so we see that because our p-value is greater than our alpha, and our alpha is set at 0.05, we know that because our p-value is greater than our alpha, we accept the null hypothesis. And that null hypothesis in this case is that equal variances are assumed. So that means we're going to look at all the numbers on this row under our t-test for equality of means. So that means this is our test statistic. That means 18 is our degrees of freedom. And this is the p-value that we're going to use. So this case, our p-value, which is a two-tailed test, equals 0.002. Now we compare this p-value to our alpha level again, which is 0.05. In this case, our p-value is less than our alpha level. which means that we're going to reject the null hypothesis and accept the alternative hypothesis, which means that yes, there is in fact a difference between men and women on the number of zombies that they encounter. This mean difference here of 4.1 is simply the difference between our males and females. We see the difference, 8.1 minus 4 is 4.1. We see this is our 95 confidence interval for the difference in terms of where we think our t-test is. So here we have our two tables that we saw previously. We just completed steps 3, which is obtaining our test statistic, and step 4, which is making a decision. And so now we just end with step 5, which is stating our conclusions. That there was a significant difference between males and females on the number of zombies encountered. And notice that we state the mean and standard deviation for each of our two groups. We have our t statistic, 3.567, with our degrees of freedom, 18, and our p-value, 0.002. Because it's significant, we follow up with a little bit more details. The mean difference of 4.1 zombies indicated a very large effect. And then we state Cohen's d, which is our effect size of 1.37. And we'll talk all about this again in much more detail next week. So just to conclude and summarize our independent samples t-test and how we run this. Again, with independent sample t-test compares two means when those means come from different groups. And we need to go to Analyze, Compare Means, Independent Samples t-test. Make sure that you go ahead and define your groups. Your test variable is going to be your dependent variable. Grouping variable is your independent variable. Define your two groups based upon what you have coded for your independent variable. And then you have your test statistic. We then look at the first table, which gives us our descriptive statistics. Our second table is what we use to go ahead and make our decision, whether or not you fail to reject the null hypothesis, which means we accept the alternative. And so we look at the second table to really come up with step 4, which is making a decision. We determine if you reject or fail to reject the null hypothesis. And so we first have to look at Levine's test for equality of variances. Look at the first sig in that table. If it's greater than 0.05, which means it's the null, we assume equal variances, and we look at all of the data at the top row under the t-test. And then once we've decided which row we're going to look at, we then look at the sig, which is the p-value, under the t-test. And then if it's less than 0.05, you reject the null. There are significant differences. You look at the mean difference to tell you how much the groups differ. And then you always report the means and standard deviations for the groups, your test statistic, your degrees of freedom, and your p-value. If it's significant, then you're also going to follow up your conclusion with reporting the mean difference and then calculating and reporting the effect size.